We finally got the remainder Overtriggers, and oh boy, do they not disappoint.
Stand up! Vanguard!
Hey Cardfighters, welcome back to another Cardfight update, and it's Tuesday again, which means we've got our weekly Overdress reveal dump, and this time we've got the news or the skill reveals of the remainder 3 Overtriggers of the 5 Overtriggers of Overdress. And we could somewhat anticipate what type of power level we would get from the already revealed Overtriggers for Dark States as well as Dragon Empire, but after today's reveal, we had no idea what was in store for us, because these remainder Overtriggers are kind of ridiculous and are pretty good in their own respective aspect. So without further ado, let's jump straight into these Overtriggers and see what each and every single nation has in store for itself. So first off, let's talk about Brand Gate, because that was the first Overtrigger we got revealed to us. And their Overtrigger is of course Star Dragon Deity of Infinitude, Eldo Breath. And this Overtrigger has the additional effect: double the power and critical of all your front row units until the end of turn. Increased to double the power and critical when activated. So basically this is somewhat of a supercharged front trigger and a front critical trigger, because all your units will turn from single crit to double crit. But the interesting part here is that this happens after you allocated the 100 million power. So one unit is actually going to get an increase of 200 million power. That doesn't change the fact that they need to PG it, but what it does change is that if your opponent does get a defensive overtrigger, that particular unit can still hit sizably enough that the opponent still needs a PG to guard it, which is really interesting, because that means we actually have a way to counter a defensive overtrigger that can even happen after you already overtriggered yourself, which is pretty interesting. But more importantly, the impact of this card is kind of ridiculous, because it is effectively a critical trigger for all your units. And that means your opponent can suddenly go from a breezing situation where they could easily take your attacks to suddenly they need to guard everything because they will probably die on the spot. And the fact that you're doubling your power means that every attack will hit for a good number. Now the main issue of this particular overtrigger is that if you don't have rear guards, this is going to be kind of weak, because the only thing that it does is it gives your Vanguard an extra power buff, and it changed in double critical, which is fine, but it's not that amazing in contrast to the other overtriggers that we see that could reset your Vanguard or just permanently increase your Vanguard with an extra 10k and a critical. But what this does, as I already explained, is that it puts your opponent in a very awkward situation, because turning all your attacks into double criticals, or maybe even more, because if you already drove check a critical trigger before activating this, you actually turn that unit into a 4 critical unit, which is also kind of ridiculous. And some units have inherent double critical, thus turning those double critical also into 4 criticals, which is still really powerful. But it puts your opponent into a situation that these 100 million power buff of the overtrigger itself actually matters, because even if you give your units 100 million power, and if you use the vanilla one, you give 2 units 100 million power, it doesn't really mean that much if your opponent is at 2 damage and they can just take them because it's just 1 damage. Then that extra power goes to waste. But thanks to this overtrigger effect, that won't be the case, because at the very least it will hit for 2 damage, and it will put your opponent into a deadly situation very fast, and probably after just 1 attack they are forced to guard it. The only situation where they don't have to guard it is that if they were at 1 damage and they take the Vanguard attack and they go to 3, because they can still take 1. But if they were at 2 or higher, taking 1 of the attacks means they have to guard the rest of the attacks, otherwise they will basically die from the onslaught. And that isn't really the case of all the other overtriggers, which is really interesting on this particular case. But this overtrigger is nice and all, but the next overtrigger takes it even one step further than that, because the overtrigger for Keter Sanctuary is kind of nutty, because the overtrigger for Keter Sanctuary is Light Dragon Deity of Honors Armor T Noah. And Armor T Noah has the effect: until end of turn, you also perform drive checks for the battles your rearguards attack. Yes, all rearguards are gonna get drive checks, which is in itself already pretty powerful because we are familiar with this type of effect. We have seen this time and time again in the past where we can give our rearguards drive checks. It's a pretty good way to increase the pressure. But this doesn't really strike home how ridiculous this effect is. Because so far, we have two archetypes within Keter Sanctuary. We have the Oracle Think Tank playstyle, which basically manipulates the top card of your deck, which can increase the consistency of hitting this overtrigger quite consistently, which means it's very much likely that you're gonna have access to these extra drive checks on your rearguard, which are also pluses because you add those cards to your hand. But a more insane thought is with Bastion. Because Bastion relies on Great Freeze, so it's very likely that your entire front row is filled with Great Freeze, so you're gonna get twin drives for each and every single attack, which is pretty insane. But on top of that, it actually synergized really insanely nicely with Bastion's restand ability, because Bastion's restand ability, yes, it's a once per turn, but it doesn't specify that the Vanguard's drive check need to reveal Great Free to restand your rearguard. So if you attack with your Vanguard and you drive check this Overtrigger, even if you do not hit a Great Free, you have still a chance to hit a Great Free with your other rearguard to then restand the unit that's still arrested, thus increasing the consistency of actually hitting those 4 of attacks, thus giving you access to those 6 drive checks. But we can take that even one step further, because knowing this, you can effectively attack first with Bastion, hopefully you get the Overtrigger, then attack with the rearguard. If you hit a Great Free, you can restand itself, otherwise you still have the other rearguard to hit a Great Free and to restand itself or the other Great Free, thus not giving you access to 6 drive checks, but actually 8 drive checks. And then suddenly the whole issue with Bastion's shield value and the Great Freeze is thrown out the window, because you suddenly got 8 cards in your hand. Yeah, that's kind of ridiculous. But in premium design wise, this card is actually pretty insane, because people already have been pointing out, this card together with Platinum ASL of the V series allows you to go infinite. Because Platinum ASL, if you have the entire skill off, it changes your drive check for the entire turn to check top 2, call one of them, and drive check the other. Meaning, you keep calling a unit to the field for every time you drive check a card, thus generating more units onto the field while you're attacking, and all those new units have the effect to drive check when attacking. So even though they might be grade 1s or grade 2s or triggers that have single drive, they still giving you that 1 extra unit to attack. So you can attack, 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 attack until you run out of cards in your deck to drive check or to superior call. Which is kind of nutty if you think about it. So yeah, this Overtrigger might be the strongest in the potential, in the ultimate potential, but it's also the weakest, because drive checking this card on turn 1 or turn 2 when you have no rear guards is basically just 100 million power and that's it. Because it doesn't give your Vanguard any extra beneficial effect. So it's the weakest of them all, because the Overtrigger for Brandgate that we just talked about, at the very least it doubles your Vanguard's critical, so it becomes 2 crits. Yes, it means nothing if your opponent perfect guarded, but in the early game they most likely are going to perfect guard your Vanguard attack. So that means that the Brandgate is already better. Dark Stage is infinitely better if it's drove check in the early game. And Dragon Empire, it at the very least resend your Vanguard so you can attack again, which also gives you extra drive check, so more cards in hand. This card, you don't want to drive check this in the early game. You want to drive check this at the earliest on turn 3, and then at the moment you have an entire board setup. But even then, you could get into a late game scenario where this card would be bad, because if you run out of resources, you have no rearguards onto the field because your opponent destroyed everything, then drive checking this card is also really, really bad. So it's pretty situational, but in those right situations, this card is insane. But then we get to the last Overtrigger, and this is a very interesting one in design-wise, because the Overtrigger for Stoicheia is pretty damn nutty as well, because that is Source Dragon Deity of Blessings, Bless Favor. And Bless Favor has the Overtrigger effect: draw a card, choose one of your units, and it gets critical +1 until the end of turn. All of your front row gets power plus 10k. If your damage zone has more cards than your opponent's, choose a card from your damage zone and heal it. If you catch on what I just said, this is basically every trigger effect in one trigger. It's the actual rainbow trigger or the omni trigger because it draws you a card for the draw trigger. It gives a unit a +1 critical for the critical trigger. It gives your entire front row plus 10k for the front trigger. And then if you have more damage than your opponent, it heals a card for the heal trigger. So it basically is the 100 million power and then every single other trigger on top of that when you drive check this card, which is pretty damn insane. And don't forget, if you drive check this card goes away and you draw a card, and then you also draw another card for this effect. So you draw 2 cards in the process, which is actually pretty good. But another very interesting thing about this card is that the front row power, it doesn't specify until the end of turn. So currently, the way how we are reading this card, it implies that the front row power stays until the end of the game. However, it's different than the one for Dark States, which increases your Vanguard for 10k and a critical, because this is allocated to those specific units. So if those units get retired, or you write a new Vanguard, or you recall something on top of them and they go to the drop zone, basically if those specific units are moved from the field, they lose the 10k power increase. That is how we are seeing it right now. They might rule it differently and say, no, the 10k power is also until the end of turn. But as far as it is now, it's until the end of until they are removed from the field itself. Now, overall wise, this card is very interesting because I think it's the most flexible of all the overtriggers, because in every situation it's actually pretty decent, because in the early game it is a draw trigger and a critical trigger, which is nice. The extra 10k power for you if you only have a Vanguard doesn't really mean that much because you're already going to get the 100 million power, and the heal will probably not come up all that often in the early game. However, that heal might come up, which is also really good, and the 10k power could actually be pretty decent if you already were rushing a little bit. So this is actually pretty flexible because it helps and promotes rushing to some extent. It can help you to set back if your opponent was a bit aggressive against you if you healed. And in other scenarios, you will get the draw and the critical, so it pushes out for a bit more. So I think this card is the more flexible in all certain scenarios. But in most instances, it doesn't really have the big blowout effect that we see on all the other overtriggers, because drive checking this in the late game is kind of okay. You probably are going to get the heal, which is nice. The 10k power could help you to overcome a defensive trigger or push a bit more, especially in combination with Magnolia, because Magnolia gives your entire back row power buff. Now with this effect, you also give your entire front row power buff, which is nice, which means that you can probably hit for every single attack as long as your opponent doesn't get the overtrigger. So there are interesting scenarios, but I think there are less insane use cases that we see with these Keter Sanctuary one, or maybe even with Dark States, or even Dragon Empire to some extent. But I think it's the most useful throughout the entire match. So it's a nice balanced version of the Overtrigger. So for what we've seen, these Overtriggers are pretty ridiculous, and they fluctuate quite heavily within their use applications, because some of them you want to drive check them as early as possible, like the Dark States one, you want to have it in turn 1, that's the most optimal. And then you have other cards that are very specific niche situations, like the Keter Sanctuary with this immense blowout potential. And then you have the other cards that are kind of generically useful, like the Stoicheia one, that's generically useful. The Dragon Empire is generically useful. Sure, they have optimal situations where you want to drive check them, but they are pretty good in every other situation. And then I think the one for Brandgate is kind of in the middle. It has specific use cases, but it's not the worst thing to drive check in the not optimal situation, because at the very least, it is a critical trigger on top of the 100 million power, at least on your Vanguard if you don't have rearguards. But if you at least have one other rearguard, that's another critical trigger you have onto the field, and if your opponent no guard your Vanguard, at least that 100 million power will not go to waste, because it forced them to have a PG or take 2 damage. So overall, these Overtriggers, I am liking the design. I'm very curious how they will impact the playstyle of their respective decks. I think the Keter Sanctuary one, as I already explained in this video, has the most impact in the playstyle of the respective decks with Bastion and the one with the Oracle Think Tank build. But I'm very curious how the other builds and maybe future builds for the respective nations will interact with these Overtriggers and might build on top of that playstyle itself, as I'm very curious of how this is going to impact the game itself. But on top of that, we have one more extra thing they revealed, because they revealed the very first DSR rarity reveal, and oh boy, I am in big trouble, because they revealed the artwork for Trickstar DSR. And as you can see here, this is pretty interesting. I'm not sure if it's your kind of cup of tea with the artwork itself, but these type of rarities are pretty damn amazing. I am really loving the design, and I'm very curious of how they're gonna do this going forward with the other DSRs, and if they're gonna do this more often in other rarities as well, because this makes the high rarity hunt also a bit more interesting for collectors and people that just want to bling out their deck to some extent. So yeah, I'm very concerned because I hope they're not 1 per case or maybe 1 per 5 case. I hope they're at least 1 per case, and maybe even every DSR, because we're also going to get Nirvana in a DSR form, and we're going to get that next week. So I'm kind of concerned for my wallet for how that's going to play out. So yeah, I am pretty hyped, not only for this reveal, but also for the Overtriggers themselves, because they do look very spicy, and they also have some premium applications with all the wacky stuff we can do in premium. So yeah, it's time to deck build, and it's time to figure out how we can break these cards to their utmost potential. Because, yeah, we've seen what they do, and you can see what the impact they have. But with it said, let me know in the comments down below, what's your favorite Overtrigger? Are you the most excited for the Dragon Empire one, Dark States, Keter Sanctuary, Stoicheia, or Brandgate? Let me know in the comments down below which Overtrigger you're the most fan of, and which you cannot wait for to try out in your deck. Let me know all your thoughts in the comment section down below. As always, this video has been brought to you by lovely patrons over at patreon.com/FrankenInsider. You guys are amazing. If you want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/FrankenInsider and become a patron today. But with that said, I'm Mr. Time Leap, and I see you guys in the next one.